She hadn't expected the evening to feel like this. The hall was filled with laughter, clinking glasses and groups of people lost in conversation. Yet, for her, it was a storm of noise with no safe corner. She stood there, clutching her purse a little too tightly, surrounded by faces she didn't recognize, faces that turned, glanced, and dismissed her just as quickly. You know that feeling, don't you? The kind where the room seems to shrink around you and every chuckle in the distance feels like it might be about you. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was just in her head, but the truth was undeniable. She was alone in a sea of strangers. Her eyes darted around the room, hoping for even one familiar smile, one anchor to remind her she wasn't invisible. Instead, she saw small groups forming circles, backs closing her out. People talking, laughing, whispering, and in those whispers she imagined the sharp edges of judgment. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, considering leaving. Would anyone even notice if she walked out? Maybe it would be easier, safer, to disappear before the weight of loneliness crushed her completely. But just as that thought crossed her mind, something happened. A movement, a presence. Someone stepped closer. Not too close, but close enough that she felt it, like a shield slipping quietly between her and the world. He wasn't part of the crowd. He wasn't one of the circling voices. He was a stranger. And then, in a calm, steady tone, he said the words that would change everything that night. "She's with me." 4 simple words, yet they sliced through the tension like a knife through rope. The whispers faltered, the stares shifted, and suddenly, she wasn't standing alone anymore. What happens next? Who was this stranger? Why did he step in for someone he didn't even know? And how did those 4 words ripple through the night, changing not just her place in the room, but the very way she saw herself? This is not just a story about an uncomfortable evening. It's about the power of one moment, one choice, one voice. Stay with me, because what began as a night of isolation turned into something far more powerful than she, or anyone else, could have imagined. She told herself it was just another evening, nothing unusual, just a gathering, people, music, light chatter. But beneath that carefully rehearsed pep talk, her stomach churned with the kind of dread that doesn't announce itself loudly, but seeps in quietly, like water finding cracks in stone. The invitation had arrived weeks ago. She almost didn't accept. In fact, she left it on her kitchen counter, unopened, for days. It wasn't that she didn't want to go. It was that she didn't want to go alone. You see, loneliness has a way of magnifying every social event. Where others see a simple evening, someone alone sees a battlefield. And tonight, that battlefield stretched out before her. The first obstacle came the moment she stepped through the door. Eyes flickered toward her, quick, assessing glances that darted away just as fast. To most, it would be harmless, nothing at all. But to her, each look carried weight. Every turn of the head whispered, "You don't belong here." She found an empty spot along the wall and anchored herself there, her hands folded tightly, her smile rehearsed but fragile. People passed by, their conversations orbiting around her but never touching. Snippets of laughter drifted into her ears and she couldn't help but wonder if it was at her expense. Time slowed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Her chest tightened with every second she stood alone. She wanted to vanish. She wanted to melt into the wallpaper, to dissolve into the shadows, but her feet refused to move. Then came the whispers. A small group nearby, 3 women, 2 men, huddled together, exchanging glances that seemed to slice right through her. They weren't speaking loudly, but the cadence of their voices was sharp, almost rehearsed. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. The laughter that followed told her enough. Her throat tightened. Was she imagining it, or were they truly mocking her? She lowered her gaze, hoping to escape notice, but in doing so, she seemed to invite more of it. One of the women leaned closer to another, muttered something, and all at once they chuckled. Not politely, cruelly. The second obstacle was even heavier, the creeping weight of memory. This wasn't the first time she had felt cornered. It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like an outsider. High school dances, college parties, even office gatherings. Always the same, her against the crowd, the silent battle of pretending not to notice, pretending not to care. And here it was again, decades later, unfolding in front of strangers who didn't even know her name. The walls felt closer now. The music, once lively, now mocked her with its cheerfulness. The more she tried to compose herself, the more her mask cracked. A bead of sweat slid down her temple. She dabbed it quickly, praying no one noticed. But they did notice, or at least it felt that way. The whispers grew bolder. The circle of strangers seemed to close in, not physically but emotionally. Each laugh another brick in the wall pressing against her. She thought about leaving, just slipping out the door, quietly, before things got worse. She rehearsed the motion in her mind. Grab the purse, take 1 step, 2 steps, find the exit. She even turned slightly, as if testing the idea. But then came the third obstacle, fear of judgment. What if someone saw her leave? What if they whispered even more? What if her departure was just another reason for them to laugh? The fear pinned her to the floor like invisible weights shackled to her ankles. Her mind raced. Why did I come? Why do I keep putting myself through this? And just when her chest felt like it might cave in under the pressure, the situation escalated. A man from the group peeled away, casually at first, but his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her pulse quicken. He approached slowly, with the kind of smirk that doesn't need words to be understood. He didn't have to say anything. His expression carried the weight of unspoken mockery. "Lost, are you?" he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Her cheeks burned. She forced a polite smile, but inside her heart thudded violently. He waited for her to respond, but when she didn't, he chuckled and walked back to his group, triumphant in his small cruelty. The laughter erupted again. She lowered her head, wishing desperately for the ground to swallow her whole. Each second dragged her deeper into the pit of humiliation. She was cornered, not by walls, not by hands, but by the crushing weight of isolation magnified under the gaze of strangers. And yet, it was in that suffocating moment that the turning point quietly began to take shape. Because not far away, someone had been watching, not with mockery, not with judgment, but with recognition. He had seen the way the group circled her like vultures. He had noticed the nervous grip on her purse, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes searched the room for an escape. And while everyone else dismissed her as invisible, to him she was impossible to ignore. The question was, would he step forward? Or would he, like all the others, turn away? The moment lingered, heavy and suffocating. She could still feel the sting of his words, "Lost, are you?" echoing in her chest. Around her, the room continued to buzz with chatter, but for her, it was as if the air had thickened. Every breath was harder to draw, every sound sharper, crueler, and yet, in the midst of that storm, there was movement. From across the room, a man, someone she had not noticed before, took a step forward, then another. His presence wasn't loud or commanding. It was steady, deliberate, almost as though he had been waiting for this precise moment. She didn't see him at first. Her gaze was locked downward, fixed on the floor as though staring hard enough might make her disappear. But the shift in the air made her glance up, and when she did, their eyes met. There was no smirk on his face, no mocking glint. His expression was calm, anchored, and, most surprisingly, kind. He walked past the group that had tormented her, not sparing them more than a passing glance, and then, with a quiet certainty that silenced the laughter in its tracks, he stopped at her side. "She's with me." The words cut through the noise, sharp and clear. For a moment the room froze. The group of whispering strangers exchanged bewildered glances. One of them muttered something under their breath, but their confidence faltered, because those words, spoken with such calm authority, shifted the balance of power. She blinked, stunned, her lips parted, but no words came. With him? She didn't even know who he was. And yet, in that instant, it didn't matter. What mattered was the way the mocking laughter evaporated. What mattered was how the eyes that had been fixed on her now looked elsewhere. The circle that had closed in around her seemed to shatter, leaving a path open. Her pulse quickened, not with fear this time, but with something else. Relief, gratitude, confusion. The stranger didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His presence alone, the simple act of standing beside her, was enough to alter the entire dynamic of the room. But the group didn't retreat easily. One of the women, the one who had laughed the loudest earlier, crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Really? Since when?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. The stranger met her gaze without flinching. "Since now," he said simply. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't boastful, but it was firm. The woman faltered. Her smirk weakened. The group shifted uncomfortably, their power suddenly fragile. And in that hesitation, the energy in the room shifted entirely. For the first time that evening, she didn't feel small. She glanced up at the man beside her, still bewildered by his intervention. Why would he do this? He doesn't even know me. But as she searched his face, she saw no trace of ulterior motive, just calm, steady resolve. The whispers behind them didn't vanish completely, but they lost their sting, no longer sharp, no longer suffocating. The group turned inward, murmuring among themselves, but the edge of cruelty had dulled, and for her, that was everything. She felt her shoulders relax, her grip on her purse loosen. The weight pressing against her chest lifted just slightly. Yet even as relief washed over her, another wave of anxiety rose. What now? Would she have to explain? Pretend she knew him? Go along with whatever story he had just created? Before she could spiral further, he leaned closer. Not too close, but enough for his voice to reach her. You don't have to say anything, he whispered. Just breathe. His words weren't dramatic. They weren't some grand declaration. But in that moment, they were exactly what she needed. And so she did. She breathed. The music around them swelled again. Laughter from other corners of the room returned to its harmless hum, and the sharp spotlight of humiliation dimmed. But the group wasn't finished. The man who had mocked her earlier stepped forward again, his pride clearly wounded. Come on, he sneered, addressing the stranger now. You don't even know her. The stranger tilted his head slightly, considering him. Then, with a calm smile, he replied, I don't need to. I just know she doesn't deserve the way you're treating her. That silenced him. The smirk vanished. The group's laughter faltered once more, replaced by uneasy shuffling. And just like that, the conflict reached its peak. The stranger hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened anyone. But his quiet defiance spoke louder than anything else could have. She stood beside him, still in disbelief, her heart pounding with the force of the moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't standing alone. The climax wasn't marked by shouting or drama. It was marked by the quiet power of someone choosing to stand beside her when no one else would. She's with me. 4 words. But to her, they meant everything. For a long moment, the words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. She's with me. The group that had surrounded her looked unsettled, their confidence fractured. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone outside their circle. Cruelty thrives in silence. When no one speaks up, it grows bolder. But now, silence had been broken. The man who had taunted her earlier shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering. His friends glanced at him as if waiting for him to reclaim control, but he stayed still, his bravado slipping through his fingers. One of the women rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, whatever, not worth it. With that, she turned away, tugging at the arm of her companion. Another followed quickly, then another. Their whispers faded into the background as they retreated, their circle broken, their sharp edges dulled, and suddenly, she wasn't surrounded anymore. The relief was immediate, almost dizzying. Her lungs expanded fully for the first time that evening. She hadn't realized how shallow her breathing had become until now. Her hands, once trembling against her purse, slowly relaxed. But relief carried its own weight. The question of why. Why had this stranger intervened? Why had he taken a risk for her? A complete unknown in a room full of people who had chosen not to. Her instinct was to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Gratitude is simple in theory, but when your heart is tangled in humiliation, fear, and sudden relief, it's not so easy to express. Instead, she glanced sideways at him. He didn't look at her right away. His eyes swept the room instead, scanning as if to make sure the tension had truly dissolved. Only when he was certain the group was gone did he turn to her. You're okay, he said gently. Not a question, a reassurance. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was. The room seemed to shift back into motion. Conversations picked up, glasses clinked again. The music played on, but she knew it wasn't the same. Something had changed, not just for her, but for the atmosphere itself. People had noticed what had happened, even if they pretended otherwise. Some glanced curiously in her direction, their eyes lingering a second too long before darting away. Others avoided her gaze altogether, as though acknowledging it would make them complicit in the silence they had kept. She felt exposed, but not in the same way as before. This time, the attention wasn't sharpened by cruelty. It was softened by something else. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Still, a question gnawed at her. Why him? Why now? She finally found her voice, though it was quieter than she intended. Why did you do that? The stranger shrugged lightly as if the answer were obvious. Because no one else did. Simple, honest, uncomplicated. And yet, to her, it was profound. She opened her mouth again but stopped. How do you thank someone for giving you back your dignity? How do you express gratitude for 4 words that had felt like a lifeline thrown into a storm? Thank you, she whispered at last. He gave a small nod, accepting the words without ceremony. But the night was far from over. Though the immediate threat had passed, the consequences rippled outward. The group, though diminished, hadn't vanished completely. They lingered at another corner of the room, casting occasional glances in her direction. Their laughter, though quieter now, carried an edge of bitterness. She noticed. He noticed too. Don't worry about them, he said calmly. But worry, she knew, was easier said than done. Memories of humiliation cling tightly, refusing to let go just because the moment has passed. She shifted uneasily, still feeling the echoes of their mockery. He seemed to sense it. Do you want to step outside? He asked. Just for a minute. She hesitated. Leaving the room felt like admitting defeat, but staying meant enduring the weight of lingering stares. After a pause, she nodded. They walked together toward the doors, his pace measured, unhurried. She noticed the way people stepped aside as they passed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but subtly, as if the dynamic had shifted, and everyone felt it. When they stepped into the cool night air, she drew in a deep breath, the crispness filling her lungs and grounding her, the noise of the room muffled behind them, replaced by the quiet hum of the evening. For the first time that night, she felt free. The stranger leaned casually against the railing, giving her space. He didn't press her with questions, didn't demand conversation. He simply stood nearby, a steady presence in the silence. It struck her then. His strength wasn't loud. It wasn't about domination or bravado. It was about steadiness, about standing firm when others faltered. You didn't have to do that, she said finally, breaking the silence. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a faint smile, he replied, maybe not, but sometimes the smallest choices make the biggest difference. The words sank into her, resonating deeper than she expected. And though the evening wasn't over, something inside her had shifted. She had walked into that room invisible. She had been cornered, mocked, diminished. But because of one stranger, because of 4 simple words, she now stood outside, breathing freely, her head a little higher. The consequences weren't just in the retreat of the bullies. They were in the quiet rebuilding of her confidence, in the realization that kindness, even from a stranger, could rewrite the story of an entire night. And as she stood there under the night sky, one truth became clear. The evening would be remembered not for the cruelty she endured, but for the courage of a stranger who chose to stand beside her when no one else would. The night air carried a calmness she hadn't felt in years. For so long she had walked into rooms feeling small, unseen, unworthy of notice. But standing there, with the echo of his words still vibrating in her memory, she's with me, something inside her began to shift. She leaned against the railing, gazing at the streetlights flickering in the distance. It wasn't just relief she felt. It was something more complex, layered. Gratitude, yes, but also possibility. The stranger didn't push her to talk. He didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter the way others might have. Instead, he allowed the quiet to stretch, as if understanding that silence itself was healing. Finally, she broke it. You know, she said softly, I almost left. I thought walking out would be easier. He nodded, his eyes steady. But you didn't. I wanted to, she admitted. I thought I'd slip out, and no one would notice. But that would have proved them right, that I didn't belong. And now? He asked. She exhaled, the breath shaky but lighter than before. Now? I'm not so sure. Maybe belonging isn't about them. Maybe it's about me. He smiled faintly. Exactly. The words sank deep, like seeds finding fertile ground. For years, she had measured herself through the eyes of others, their approval, their acceptance, their recognition. But tonight showed her something different. Worth wasn't granted by strangers. It was claimed. Her mind drifted back to all the times she had felt invisible. High school dances where she clung to the edges of the gymnasium. Office parties where conversations flowed around her like water around a rock. Even family gatherings where cousins clustered together, leaving her on the margins. Each memory had layered itself on her shoulders, building a weight she carried silently. But tonight that weight cracked, because for once someone had seen her, without judgment, without history, without expectation. Just seen her. "Do you always do that?" she asked after a pause. "Step in for people you don't know?" He shrugged lightly. "Not always. But when I see someone cornered, I can't just stand by. Silence helps the wrong people." His words were simple, but they struck her like lightning. Silence helps the wrong people. She thought about how often she had been silent, not just tonight, but in countless moments across her life. How often had she swallowed her words, avoided confrontation, shrunk herself down to avoid attention? And each time she did, hadn't it only given more power to those who dismissed her? Her chest tightened, not with shame, but with awakening. "I've been quiet too long," she whispered almost to herself. The stranger didn't respond right away. He let the words hang, let her own voice echo back to her. Then softly, he said, "Maybe tonight is the start of something different." She turned those words over in her mind. A start, a beginning. Not just the end of humiliation, but the beginning of transformation. For the first time in years, she imagined walking into a room without fear, not needing to scan for allies, not waiting for someone else to validate her presence, walking in as though she had every right to be there, because she did. The thought was almost too big, too bold, but it didn't feel impossible anymore. Inside, the music still played. The laughter still flowed. Life inside that hall went on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But for her, everything had changed. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the shift in her posture. The timid curve of uncertainty gave way to a quiet confidence. She wasn't fully transformed yet. That would take time. But the first spark had been lit. The stranger seemed to notice. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, as if recognizing the change before she fully did herself. "You know," he said, "strength isn't always about standing alone. Sometimes it's about accepting help when it comes." She met his eyes, holding his gaze. "And sometimes," she replied, "it's about realizing you're stronger than you thought." They shared a brief smile, one that carried no pretense, no performance, just truth. As they stood together under the night sky, she realized that the evening's cruelty no longer defined her memory of it. Instead, it was this moment, the quiet air, the stranger's presence, the clarity unfolding within her, that would last. Transformation doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a whisper, 4 words, a gentle smile, a decision not to remain silent. And in that transformation, she discovered not just her own strength, but a new understanding of what it means to truly be seen. The night wasn't over. The music still waited inside. The whispers might return if she stepped back in, but now she wasn't afraid of them, because she had learned something powerful. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their acceptance. She only needed the courage to take up her space. And tonight, for the first time, she felt ready to do exactly that. When they finally stepped back into the hall, the atmosphere had subtly changed. The night still carried music, chatter, and clinking glasses, but the weight that had pressed down on her chest earlier had lifted. She walked with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed, her steps no longer hesitant, her posture no longer timid. People noticed, not overtly, but through the subtlest of shifts. A glance, a nod, a pause in a conversation. The group that had cornered her earlier avoided her eyes, their confidence deflated. No longer could they impose fear or control. The quiet ripple of courage had undone the influence they wielded so effortlessly moments ago. Beside her, the stranger walked silently, his presence still calm but undeniably powerful. He didn't seek recognition or thanks. He simply remained there, a constant reminder that sometimes one small act can change everything. She realized something profound. The strength she had thought depended on the acceptance of others had been lying dormant within her all along. The stranger's intervention had been the spark, but the fire, the real transformation, was hers to carry forward. As the evening drew toward its close, she found a quiet corner and paused. She breathed deeply, letting herself savor the shift in her own perception. She wasn't defined by fear anymore. She wasn't invisible, and she certainly didn't need anyone else's validation to feel worthy. The stranger stood a few feet away, giving her space, yet his presence still offered a sense of security. She looked over and he gave a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest gestures of courage can have the greatest impact. Her mind wandered back to the earlier moments, the whispers, the mocking glances, the suffocating isolation. They hadn't disappeared entirely, but their power had. And in their place, something else had taken root: confidence, self-respect, and an awareness that she could face similar challenges in the future with grace and strength. She realized that the night had been more than just a social gathering. It had been a lesson, not one taught in classrooms or books, but through experience, through courage, empathy, and the simple choice of standing up when it mattered most. The stranger eventually nodded, giving her a gentle cue. It was time to go. She walked toward the exit, each step lighter than the last, the memory of fear replaced with a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. Outside, the cool night air greeted her. Stars twinkled faintly overhead, indifferent witnesses to the small yet powerful human drama that had unfolded within the hall. She paused, looking back once, and then forward, toward a future she now felt ready to face. And as she walked away, one thought crystallized clearly in her mind. Courage isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive with a flourish or a proclamation. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it comes in the form of 4 simple words. She's with me. Words that reminded her that even when the world seems cruel, even when you feel cornered, support can appear in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes it's that support, whether from a stranger or from within, that can change everything. So here's the question for you. When was the last time you stood up for someone, or for yourself, when it mattered most? If you've ever witnessed someone underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, don't stay silent. Your courage, your voice, even a single gesture can make a difference bigger than you imagine. And if you've ever felt invisible, remember this: someone, somewhere may stand up for you. But more importantly, you can stand up for yourself. Comment below with a moment when either you or someone else changed the course of a difficult situation with a small but brave act. Share your story and inspire others. You never know who might need to hear it today.